The billionaire fired the waitress for messing up an order, but regretted it seconds later. Are you ready for a story that will completely change how you see success, compassion, and the true power of second chances? Today, we're diving into an incredible tale that proves sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest discoveries about what really matters in life. If this story moves you like I know it will, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications because you definitely don't want to miss powerful stories like this one. Trust me, what you're about to hear will remind you why kindness is the most valuable currency in the world. Let's begin. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Le Bernardin, one of New York City's most prestigious restaurants, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the bustling Manhattan street below. The October evening had brought with it the kind of weather that made the wealthy retreat to their exclusive havens, seeking comfort in perfect service, exquisite cuisine, and the kind of insulated luxury that money could buy. Inside the restaurant, crystal chandeliers cast warm, golden light over pristine white tablecloths, while the soft murmur of sophisticated conversation blended with the gentle clinking of expensive silverware against hand-painted porcelain. At table 12, positioned strategically in a corner that offered both privacy and commanding views of the dining room, sat Marcus Wellington III, a man whose very presence seemed to alter the atmosphere around him. At 37, he was the living embodiment of American corporate power and inherited privilege, tall, impeccably groomed, with the kind of sharp features that belonged on the cover of Fortune magazine. His coal-black hair was perfectly styled, despite the dampness outside. His steel-grey eyes missed nothing as they surveyed his domain, and his custom-tailored Savile Row suit fit his athletic frame with the precision that only came from London's finest tailors and a lifestyle maintained by personal trainers, nutritionists, and a staff whose sole purpose was ensuring his comfort and success. Wellington Holdings, the multinational conglomerate that Marcus had inherited from his grandfather and expanded into a global empire, controlled assets worth over $15 billion. The company's tentacles reached into every sector of the economy: technology, pharmaceuticals, real estate, energy, entertainment, and finance, making Marcus one of the most powerful and influential businessmen in the world. His name appeared regularly in Forbes, Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal, usually accompanied by articles that praised his business acumen, while carefully avoiding any mention of the ruthless tactics and callous disregard for human consequences that had characterized his rise to the pinnacle of corporate success. His personal wealth, estimated by various financial publications at somewhere between $4 and $5 billion, afforded him a lifestyle that most people could barely imagine. He owned a penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue that overlooked Central Park, an estate in the Hamptons that had been featured in Architectural Digest, a villa in Tuscany that had once belonged to a Renaissance nobleman, and a yacht that was large enough to require its own crew of 35. His collection of vintage automobiles was valued in the tens of millions. His art collection included works by Picasso, Van Gogh, and Monet, and his wine cellar contained bottles worth more than most people's annual salaries. But wealth and power, Marcus had learned, came with their own unique pressures and expectations. Every decision he made affected thousands of employees, millions of shareholders, and countless communities around the world where Wellington Holdings operated. The weight of such responsibility might have been crushing for someone with a more sensitive nature, but Marcus had long ago developed the kind of emotional armor that allowed him to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by their human consequences. He saw business as a game played on a global scale, where sentiment and compassion were luxuries that successful players could not afford. Tonight's dinner was particularly important to Marcus's long-term strategic plans. Across from him sat three representatives from a major European investment consortium, men whose approval could unlock access to markets and opportunities that would expand Wellington Holdings' influence across the Atlantic. The deal they were discussing involved the acquisition of several struggling manufacturing companies in Eastern Europe, businesses that could be restructured, streamlined, and made profitable through the kind of aggressive cost-cutting measures that Marcus had perfected over the years. "The numbers are quite compelling," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had never been wrong about a major business decision. "We're projecting a return on investment of 45% within the first 24 months, with the potential for significantly higher returns once we implement the operational improvements we've identified." Heinrich Müller, the lead representative from the German investment group, nodded thoughtfully as he reviewed the financial projections spread across their table. "Your track record certainly speaks for itself, Mr. Wellington. But I must ask about the human impact of these operational improvements. How many positions are we discussing eliminating?" Marcus's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. The same look that appeared whenever someone questioned the methods that had made him so successful. "Approximately 3,000 positions will be eliminated in the first phase, with another 1,500 in the second phase. These companies are grossly overstaffed and operate with the kind of inefficiencies that are simply unsustainable in the modern global economy." The casual way he dismissed the livelihoods of over 4,000 people didn't escape the notice of the European investors, who exchanged glances that suggested they were accustomed to a different approach to business ethics. But they were here because Marcus Wellington delivered results, and results were ultimately what mattered in their world, even if the methods used to achieve them were sometimes distasteful. "These workers," Marcus continued, warming to his favorite theme, "have become complacent and entitled over the years. They expect job security and benefits without understanding that businesses exist to generate profit, not to provide social welfare. Most of them lack the skills and adaptability needed to compete in the 21st century economy. Frankly, we'd be doing them a favor by forcing them to develop some initiative and find ways to add real value instead of just collecting paychecks for showing up." As if summoned by his words, their waitress approached the table with the practiced grace that came from years of experience in high-end service. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with the kind of natural beauty that no amount of expensive cosmetics could improve upon. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon that complemented her classic features, and her blue eyes held an intelligence and warmth that seemed somehow out of place in the rarefied atmosphere of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, with a voice that was cultured and warm, though Marcus barely looked up from his documents as she approached. "I'm Emily, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Have you had a chance to review the wine list, or would you like me to make some recommendations to complement your meal selections?" Marcus glanced up briefly, taking in her appearance with the same calculating assessment he applied to everything else in his orbit. She was attractive enough to be serving in an establishment like Le Bernardin, but there was something about her manner, a confidence and intelligence that seemed to suggest she was educated beyond what her current position might indicate. For a brief moment, he wondered what circumstances had led someone with her obvious qualities to be working as a waitress, but the thought disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, dismissed as irrelevant to his immediate concerns. "We'll start with the 2015 Chassagne Montrachet," Marcus said without looking at her, his attention already returning to the financial projections. "And bring us the chef's tasting menu. We're discussing business, so we don't want to be interrupted unless absolutely necessary." Emily nodded professionally, though Marcus missed the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested his dismissive manner hadn't gone unnoticed. "Of course, sir." The chef's tasting menu this evening features 8 courses, beginning with the Kushi oysters with champagne foam and concluding with the dark chocolate soufflé with salted caramel. The sommelier has paired each course with wines that will enhance the flavors, but I can arrange for you to continue with the chassagne montrachet throughout the meal if you prefer. Fine, whatever, Marcus replied, waving a hand in dismissal. Just bring the food, and don't bother us with unnecessary details. Emily's smile remained professional, despite the rudeness of his response. Very good, sir. I'll have the sommelier send over the wine immediately. As she turned to leave, Heinrich Müller, who had been observing the interaction with growing discomfort, spoke up. Excuse me, miss, he said in his accented English. The restaurant is quite beautiful this evening. Have you worked here long? Emily paused, clearly surprised that one of the diners was taking the time to engage her in conversation. Thank you, sir. I've been here for about 8 months now. It's a wonderful restaurant with an incredible kitchen team. Marcus looked up from his papers with visible irritation, annoyed that his presentation was being interrupted by small talk with the help. Heinrich, we don't need to chat with the waitress. We have important matters to discuss. But Heinrich, who came from a European business culture that placed greater emphasis on treating service staff with respect, continued the conversation. And do you enjoy the work? It must be quite demanding in a restaurant of this caliber. Emily's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm as she answered. I really do enjoy it, sir. The pace can be challenging, but I love learning about fine cuisine and wine, and our guests are usually wonderful. I'm actually using this position to support myself while I finish my graduate studies in social work at Columbia. Marcus felt a flash of annoyance at this revelation. He disliked it when service workers tried to present themselves as more than what they were, as if their temporary circumstances were somehow ennobling, rather than simply indicating their failure to achieve something more substantial. In his experience, people who worked in service positions while claiming to be pursuing higher aspirations were usually deluding themselves about their real capabilities and prospects. Social work, he said, with a tone that made his opinion of the field abundantly clear. How altruistic of you. Emily's smile faltered slightly at the condescension in his voice, but she maintained her professional composure. I believe in trying to help people who are facing difficult circumstances, sir. There's a lot of satisfaction in being able to make a positive difference in someone's life. Marcus's expression grew even colder. The young woman's idealistic nonsense about helping people was exactly the kind of bleeding heart mentality that he believed was undermining American competitiveness in the global economy. People who chose careers in social work were, in his view, either naive do-gooders who didn't understand how the real world operated, or individuals who lacked the intelligence and drive necessary to succeed in fields that actually contributed to economic growth and prosperity. How admirable, he said with obvious sarcasm. And when you finish your studies, I suppose you'll be dedicating your life to helping all the people who lack the initiative to help themselves. The comment was deliberately cruel, designed to put Emily in her place and demonstrate to his European guests that he didn't tolerate pretension from the help. But instead of the embarrassment or deference he expected, Emily's eyes flashed with something that looked remarkably like anger before she regained her professional composure. I believe that everyone deserves compassion and support, sir, she said quietly. Sometimes people face circumstances beyond their control, and having someone who cares can make all the difference in helping them rebuild their lives. Marcus's jaw tightened at what he interpreted as a subtle challenge to his worldview. This waitress, this nobody who was serving him dinner, was presuming to lecture him about compassion and helping people. The audacity was breathtaking, and it triggered the kind of cold rage that he usually reserved for business rivals who dared to oppose him in boardrooms and negotiations. Is that so? He said, his voice dropping to the menacing whisper that his employees had learned to fear. And I suppose you have extensive experience with these unfortunate people who need your compassion and support." Emily hesitated for a moment, clearly recognizing that the conversation had taken a dangerous turn, but unsure how to extricate herself without seeming unprofessional. "I volunteer at a homeless shelter on weekends, sir, and I've seen firsthand how quickly circumstances can change for people who thought they were secure." "You do." The admission was like waving a red flag in front of Marcus's barely controlled anger. Not only was this waitress presuming to lecture him about social responsibility, but she was actually spending her free time working with the kind of people he viewed as parasites on society, individuals who expected others to solve their problems instead of taking responsibility for their own failures. "A homeless shelter," he repeated, his voice heavy with disgust. "So you spend your weekends enabling people who are too lazy or incompetent to take care of themselves. How very noble of you." The European investors were beginning to look uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, recognizing that Marcus was working himself into one of the cold rages that had become legendary in business circles. Heinrich Müller cleared his throat diplomatically, trying to diffuse the situation before it escalated further. "Perhaps we should focus on our dinner," he suggested gently. "I'm sure the young lady has other tables to attend to." But Marcus was beyond caring about diplomatic niceties or business relationships. This waitress had challenged his fundamental beliefs about success, failure, and personal responsibility, and he was not going to let her impertinence go unpunished. In his world, people who questioned his authority or worldview were dealt with swiftly and decisively, regardless of their station in life. "No, Heinrich," he said, never taking his eyes off Emily. "I think this conversation is quite illuminating. Our waitress here believes in helping people who can't help themselves, which makes me curious about her own circumstances. Tell me, Emily, what led you to this career in social assistance? Was it perhaps some personal experience with failure that gave you such insight into the minds of losers?" Emily's face went pale, and for the first time since approaching their table, she looked genuinely shaken. Marcus could see that his verbal attack had hit home, and he felt a surge of satisfaction at having put her back in her proper place. Whatever personal difficulties this young woman had experienced, they had clearly given her the kind of soft-hearted mentality that he despised in people who should know better. I should get your wine order started," Emily stammered, clearly trying to escape from a conversation that had become both personally painful and professionally dangerous. But Marcus wasn't finished with her yet. Something about her earlier confidence and intelligence had triggered his predatory instincts, and he wanted to complete the process of destroying whatever sense of dignity or self-worth she might have retained. It was the same instinct that drove him to crush business competitors even after victory was assured, the need to demonstrate his superiority so completely that his opponents would never dare to challenge him again. "Answer the question," he said with quiet menace. "What personal failures led you to develop such sympathy for other failures? Did your family lose everything through poor decisions? Did someone you cared about prove incapable of taking care of themselves?" Emily's hands were shaking now, and Marcus could see tears forming in her eyes, despite her obvious efforts to maintain professional control. The other diners at nearby tables were beginning to notice the confrontation, their own conversations growing quieter as they sensed the drama unfolding at table 12. "My father lost his job when his company was acquired and restructured," Emily said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "He was 55 years old and couldn't find another position at his level. We lost our house, and he started drinking because he felt like he had failed his family. He died 2 years ago from liver disease, still believing that he wasn't good enough to take care of the people he loved." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and for a moment, even Marcus felt a flicker of something that might have been conscience. but the feeling was quickly overwhelmed by his anger at being made to feel uncomfortable by a waitress who should have known better than to share personal information that was designed to make him feel guilty about his business practices. "So your father was one of those middle managers who couldn't adapt to changing circumstances," he said with deliberate cruelty. "And instead of learning from his failures, he chose to drink himself to death rather than taking responsibility for rebuilding his life. And now you've decided to dedicate your career to enabling other people to avoid taking responsibility for their own circumstances. How perfectly pathetic." Emily's composure finally shattered completely. Tears began flowing down her cheeks as the full impact of Marcus's verbal assault hit home, and she swayed slightly as if she might faint from the emotional shock of having her father's memory attacked so viciously by a stranger who knew nothing about their family's suffering. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I just need to get your wine order." But Marcus had tasted blood, and the predatory part of his nature that had made him so successful in business demanded complete victory over this presumptuous waitress who had dared to challenge his world-view. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying clearly to the surrounding tables as he delivered what he intended to be the killing blow. "You know what I think," he said with ice-cold precision. "I think you're exactly like your father. Someone who makes excuses instead of taking responsibility. Someone who expects the world to accommodate their weaknesses instead of developing the strength to succeed. The only difference is that he had the decency to drink himself to death instead of spending years being a burden on society." Emily's face went white, as if she had been physically struck, and she took an involuntary step backward from the table. The surrounding diners had stopped pretending to focus on their own meals and were now openly staring at the confrontation, some with expressions of shock and disgust at Marcus's cruelty. Heinrich Müller stood up from his chair, his face flushed with anger. "Mr. Wellington, this is completely unacceptable behavior. You will apologize to this young woman immediately." But Marcus was beyond caring about business relationships or social conventions. The waitress had challenged his fundamental beliefs about success and failure, and he was determined to destroy her completely for her presumption. "I will not apologize to someone whose very existence represents everything that's wrong with this country," he said loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. "People like her and her pathetic father are parasites who expect others to solve their problems instead of developing the skills and determination necessary to succeed." Emily was crying openly now, her professional composure completely destroyed by the vicious personal attack. Several other diners were beginning to murmur angrily among themselves, clearly appalled by Marcus's behavior, but uncertain whether they should intervene in what appeared to be a private confrontation. "I want a different waitress," Marcus announced to the room in general, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his demands met immediately. "This one is clearly incompetent and emotionally unstable, and I refuse to be served by someone who can't maintain professional standards." The maitre d' appeared at their table as if materializing from thin air, clearly alerted by the commotion that something had gone seriously wrong. "Is there a problem here, sir?" he asked, with the kind of diplomatic concern that expensive restaurants trained their staff to display when wealthy customers created scenes. "Yes, there's a problem," Marcus said coldly. "Your waitress has been unprofessional, argumentative, and emotionally unstable. I want her removed from our service immediately, and frankly, I question whether someone with such poor judgment and lack of emotional control should be working in an establishment of this caliber at all." Emily looked at the maître d' with desperate pleading in her eyes, silently begging him not to believe Marcus's characterization of what had transpired. But Marcus's reputation and wealth spoke louder than her tears, and the maître d's primary concern was maintaining the satisfaction of a customer who probably spent more on wine in a year than most of his staff earned in salary. "Of course, sir," the maître d' said smoothly. "I'll arrange for another server immediately. Emily, Please return to the back of house." Emily nodded through her tears and began to turn away, but Marcus wasn't finished with her yet. The predatory instinct that had made him so successful in business demanded complete victory, total humiliation of anyone who dared to oppose him. "Actually," he said with deliberate malice, "I think this incident demonstrates such poor judgment and lack of professionalism that you should consider whether this young woman is suitable for employment here at all. Customers shouldn't have to deal with waitresses who break down crying and create scenes because they can't handle simple conversations." The implication was clear. Marcus was demanding that Emily be fired, using his influence and wealth to destroy her livelihood because she had dared to challenge his worldview and remind him of the human consequences of his business practices. The maitre d' looked uncomfortable with the demand, but Marcus's power and reputation made it dangerous to refuse his request. I'll speak with management about the situation, sir," the maitre d' said carefully. "No," Marcus said with finality. "Speak with them now. I want this resolved immediately. Either she's terminated for unprofessional conduct, or I'll be taking my business elsewhere and making sure everyone in my social circle knows why." The threat was unmistakable. Comply with his demand or face the consequences of losing not just his business, but potentially the business of dozens of other wealthy customers who would follow his recommendation. Emily's job, her ability to support herself while completing her graduate studies, her entire future, all of it hung in the balance because she had dared to show compassion for people Marcus viewed as failures. The maitre d' nodded reluctantly. "Emily, you're terminated effective immediately. Please collect your belongings and leave the premises." Emily's face crumbled as the words hit her, the final blow in a series of attacks that had systematically destroyed her dignity, her composure, and now her livelihood. She looked around the restaurant desperately, as if hoping someone would intervene on her behalf, but the other diners averted their eyes, unwilling to risk Marcus's wrath by defending a mere waitress against one of the most powerful men in New York. "Please," she whispered to the maitre d', "I need this job. I have student loans and rent, and I'm so close to finishing school. I didn't do anything wrong." But the maitre d' had already made his decision, prioritizing Marcus's satisfaction over Emily's desperation. "I'm sorry, but the decision has been made. You need to leave now." Emily looked one last time at Marcus, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain, desperation, and something that might have been pity. Then she turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant, her shoulders shaking with barely contained sobs as she went to collect her belongings and leave the job that had been supporting her dreams of helping other people avoid the kind of suffering her family had experienced. Marcus watched her go with a sense of satisfaction that lasted exactly until she disappeared from view. Then, as if a switch had been thrown in his brain, the full magnitude of what he had just done began to sink in. The predatory rage that had driven him to destroy Emily's livelihood began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of the cruelty and injustice of his actions. Heinrich Müller was staring at him with undisguised disgust. "That was one of the most appalling displays of bullying I have ever witnessed," he said with quiet fury. "That young woman did nothing to deserve such treatment, and your behavior has been absolutely inexcusable." The other European investors nodded in agreement, their faces showing the same revulsion that Heinrich had expressed. Marcus realized with growing horror that his attack on Emily had not impressed his potential business partners. It had revealed a side of his character that they found repugnant and incompatible with their values. "She was being presumptuous," Marcus said weakly, trying to justify his actions even as he began to understand their implications. "Service staff shouldn't engage customers in discussions about social issues. She was trying to do her job and answer polite questions that I asked her," Heinrich replied coldly. "Your response was to attack her personally, mock her father's death, and then use your power to have her fired for the crime of showing compassion for other human beings. It was despicable. Marcus felt the blood draining from his face as Heinrich's words forced him to confront what he had actually done. Emily hadn't been presumptuous or unprofessional. She had been trying to serve their table while engaging in polite conversation when asked direct questions. Her only crime had been revealing that she cared about helping people who were struggling, and that her own family had experienced the kind of economic devastation that Marcus's business practices regularly inflicted on others. "I think our business here is concluded," Heinrich said, standing up and gesturing for his colleagues to do the same. "We have no interest in partnering with someone who treats working people with such contempt and cruelty. Your reputation preceded you, Mr. Wellington, but I had hoped the stories were exaggerated. Clearly they were not." As the European investors gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Marcus felt panic beginning to set in. The deal they had been discussing was worth hundreds of millions of dollars and would have opened up markets that Wellington Holdings had been trying to access for years. Losing their partnership would be a devastating blow to his expansion plans and would likely cost him billions in potential future revenue. "Heinrich, wait," he called out desperately. "I may have been a bit harsh, but surely we can work past this minor incident." Heinrich paused and looked back at Marcus with an expression of pure contempt. "Minor incident? You destroyed that young woman's livelihood because she reminded you that your business practices have human consequences. You mocked her dead father and used your wealth to punish her for showing compassion. There is nothing minor about what you just did, and there is nothing we need to work past. Good evening, Mr. Wellington." As the Europeans left the restaurant, Marcus found himself alone at table 12. Surrounded by the disapproving stares of other diners who had witnessed his attack on Emily. The satisfaction he had felt at putting her in her place had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing awareness of the magnitude of his cruelty and its consequences. For the first time in years, Marcus found himself truly examining his own behavior and its impact on others. Emily had been a young woman trying to better herself through education, while working to support herself in one of the most expensive cities in America. She had shown compassion for people who were struggling, inspired by her own family's experience with economic hardship and personal tragedy, and his response had been to destroy her livelihood because her values challenged his worldview. The more Marcus thought about what had transpired, the more ashamed he became. Emily's father had lost his job when his company was restructured, the exact kind of corporate reorganization that Marcus specialized in. Her family had lost their home and suffered devastating personal consequences because of business decisions that were probably identical to ones Marcus made regularly without considering their human impact. And when Emily had tried to channel her personal experience into a career helping others, Marcus had seen that compassion as weakness worthy of punishment. Marcus pulled out his phone and called his assistant, despite the late hour. "Jennifer, I need you to find out everything you can about the waitress who was just fired from Le Bernardin. Her name is Emily. She's a graduate student at Columbia studying social work, and she volunteers at a homeless shelter. I need her full name, contact information, and details about her situation immediately." "Sir." Jennifer's voice reflected confusion at the unusual request. "Is there a problem?" "Just do it," Marcus snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. Even his assistant, who was accustomed to his demanding nature, didn't deserve to be treated rudely because he was dealing with guilt over his treatment of Emily. "I'm sorry, Jennifer," he said more gently. "This is important. I need that information as quickly as possible." While he waited for Jennifer to call back with Emily's information, Marcus sat alone in the restaurant, ignoring the replacement waitress who had been assigned to his table and thinking about the events that had led to this moment. His childhood had been one of privilege and entitlement, where his family's wealth had insulated him from the kind of economic insecurity that Emily's family had experienced. He had attended the best schools, had access to the finest opportunities, and had inherited a business empire that provided him with resources most people could barely imagine. But somewhere along the way, Marcus realized he had lost sight of the human beings whose lives were affected by his decisions. The thousands of workers whose jobs he had eliminated, the communities that had been devastated by his plant closures, the families that had been destroyed by his restructuring efforts, they had all become abstract numbers on spreadsheets rather than real people with real lives and real suffering. Emily's father had been one of those numbers. A 55-year-old man who had probably worked his entire adult life, who had supported his family and contributed to his community, who had found himself unemployed and unemployable because of decisions made in boardrooms by people like Marcus, who had never considered the human consequences of their actions. And when he couldn't find another job, when his sense of self-worth had been destroyed by a system that discarded experienced workers in favor of cheaper alternatives, he had turned to alcohol and eventually died from the shame and despair of believing himself to be a failure. Emily had lived through that tragedy and had chosen to dedicate her life to helping other people avoid the same fate. Instead of becoming bitter or seeking revenge against the system that had destroyed her father, she had chosen compassion. She was working to support herself through graduate school while volunteering at a homeless shelter, trying to provide the kind of support and understanding that might have saved her father if it had been available to him. And Marcus's response to her story had been to mock her father's memory and destroy her ability to continue her education and her work helping others. It was a level of cruelty that he was only now beginning to fully comprehend. Jennifer called back within 30 minutes with the information Marcus had requested. Emily's full name was Emily Sarah Patterson. She was 26 years old, and she was indeed a graduate student at Columbia's School of Social Work, where she was specializing in trauma counseling and addiction recovery. She volunteered every weekend at the Riverside Homeless Shelter in Manhattan, where she helped provide counseling and support services to people experiencing homelessness. She lived alone in a studio apartment in Queens that cost her nearly half of her income from the restaurant, and she was carrying over $60,000 in student loan debt from her undergraduate degree and her current graduate program. "Sir," Jennifer added carefully, "I also found out that she was scheduled to graduate in May and had already accepted a position with a non-profit organization that provides support services to families affected by corporate layoffs and economic displacement. The position would have allowed her to pay off her student loans and pursue her goal of opening a counseling center that specifically helps middle-aged workers who have been displaced by corporate restructuring." The information hit Marcus like a physical blow. Emily hadn't just been a waitress with vague aspirations toward social work. She was a dedicated professional who was months away from beginning a career specifically focused on helping people like her father avoid the despair and self-destruction that had killed him. By having her fired, Marcus had potentially derailed not just her education and career, but also her ability to help countless other families avoid the tragedy that had destroyed her own. "Jennifer," Marcus said quietly, "I need you to arrange a meeting with Emily Patterson as soon as possible, tomorrow morning if she's available." "What should I tell her the meeting is about, sir?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. "Tell her that I want to apologize for my behavior tonight and discuss how I might be able to help repair the damage I've caused." After ending the call, Marcus sat in his empty apartment, looking out at the lights of Manhattan and thinking about the evening's events. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to make tough decisions without being paralyzed by sentiment or concern for the feelings of others. He had viewed emotional detachment as a strength that allowed him to succeed where others might fail due to misplaced compassion or excessive empathy. But tonight had shown him the difference between necessary business decisions and gratuitous cruelty. Firing Emily had served no business purpose and had accomplished nothing except satisfying his ego and demonstrating his power over someone who was vulnerable. It had been bullying, pure and simple, and it had cost him not only a potentially lucrative business partnership, but also his own peace of mind. Marcus spent the night researching Emily's work at the homeless shelter and learning about the kind of services that organizations like hers provided. He read testimonials from people who had been helped by trauma counselors and social workers, stories of individuals who had been pulled back from despair by professionals who understood their pain and offered practical support for rebuilding their lives. By morning, Marcus had begun to understand not just the magnitude of his cruelty toward Emily, but also the value and importance of the work she was trying to do. Her compassion wasn't weakness. It was strength applied in service of healing rather than destruction. Her dedication to helping others wasn't naive idealism. It was a practical response to real problems that affected real people in profound ways. Jennifer had arranged for Emily to meet with Marcus at his office at 10 o'clock, though she had been reluctant to agree to the meeting and had only consented after Jennifer assured her that Marcus genuinely wanted to apologize and make amends for his behavior. When Emily arrived at the Wellington Holdings headquarters, she looked tired and stressed, as if she had spent the night worrying about her financial situation and her ability to complete her graduate program without the income from her restaurant job. Marcus met her in a small conference room rather than his imposing executive office, wanting to create an environment that felt less intimidating and more conducive to honest conversation. When Emily entered the room, he could see that she was nervous and uncertain about why he had requested this meeting. "Emily," Marcus began, standing up as she entered, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you have every reason to refuse." Emily took the seat he offered, but remained visibly tense. "Your assistant said you wanted to apologize, but I have to admit I'm confused about why. What happened last night was pretty clear. You didn't like what I said, and you used your influence to have me fired. I'm not sure what there is to apologize for, since you accomplished exactly what you wanted." Marcus felt the shame of her words like a knife to his heart. "What I accomplished was the destruction of an innocent person's livelihood because my pride was hurt by being reminded that my actions have consequences for other people. It was inexcusable behavior, and I am deeply, profoundly sorry for what I put you through." Emily studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether his apology was genuine or simply another form of manipulation. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally, "but words don't pay my rent or my student loans. I need that job, Mr. Wellington. And now I have to start over with finding work while also dealing with references from a restaurant where I was fired for supposedly being unprofessional." Marcus nodded, understanding that his apology, while necessary, was insufficient to repair the damage he had caused. "You're right, and that's why I want to do more than just apologize. I want to help fix the problems I've created." "What do you mean?" Emily asked suspiciously. Marcus had spent much of the night thinking about how he could meaningfully address the harm he had caused, not just to Emily personally, but to his own understanding of success and responsibility. "First, I've already spoken with the management at Le Bernardin. You'll be receiving a call this afternoon offering you your job back with a formal apology from the restaurant and a guarantee that last night's incident will not appear in your employment record." Emily's eyes widened with surprise and relief. "Really? They'll actually take me back?" "Yes, but more than that," Marcus continued. "I've also established a scholarship fund at Columbia that will cover your remaining tuition and living expenses through graduation. You shouldn't have to work in restaurants to support yourself while you're completing your education." Emily stared at him in shock. I don't understand. Why would you do that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, trying to find the words to explain his own transformation. "Because last night you showed me something I had forgotten, that compassion isn't weakness and that helping people isn't enabling them. Your father wasn't a failure, Emily. He was a victim of a system that discards people when they become inconvenient. And that system is one that I have profited from without considering its human costs. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief rather than pain. You really understand what happened to him. I'm beginning to, Marcus said, and I want to do more than just help you personally. I want to fund your counseling center, the one you plan to open to help people like your father. I want to support the work you're doing at the homeless shelter, and I want to learn from you about how someone like me can use their resources to help rather than harm. Emily was quiet for a long time, processing what Marcus was offering and trying to understand his motivations. "What made you change your mind?" she asked finally. Marcus thought about his answer carefully. "Seeing the look in your eyes when you talked about your father made me realize that I've spent my career creating the same kind of pain for thousands of other families. I've justified it as business necessity, but last night showed me that I've become someone who takes pleasure in other people's suffering. That's not who I want to be anymore." Emily nodded slowly. "My father used to say that everyone deserves a second chance to become the person they're meant to be. I think he would have liked knowing that his story might help someone else find their way to becoming better." Over the following months, Marcus's commitment to change proved to be genuine and lasting. He established the Patterson Family Foundation, named in honor of Emily's father, which provided support services for workers displaced by corporate restructuring. He reformed Wellington Holdings' business practices to include consideration of human impact in all major decisions, often at significant cost to short-term profits, but with surprisingly positive effects on long-term sustainability and employee loyalty. Most importantly, Marcus developed a friendship with Emily that challenged and expanded his understanding of success, compassion, and responsibility. She became an informal advisor to his philanthropic efforts, helping him understand how to use his wealth and influence to address rather than create human suffering. Emily graduated from Columbia with honors and opened her counseling center with Marcus's support, creating a model program that was eventually replicated in cities across the country. Her work helping families affected by economic displacement became nationally recognized, and she was frequently invited to speak at conferences and universities about trauma-informed approaches to economic recovery. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The man who had once taken pride in his emotional detachment and ruthless efficiency discovered that compassion and business success were not mutually exclusive. His reformed approach to corporate leadership actually improved Wellington Holdings' performance, while also improving the lives of his employees and the communities where his company operated. Years later, when Marcus was asked by business journalists about the turning point in his approach to leadership and philanthropy, he would always mention the night he fired a waitress for showing compassion and the education in humanity that her forgiveness had provided him. It had been, he would say, the most expensive lesson of his life, and also the most valuable, teaching him that true success was measured not by what you could take from the world, but by what you could give back to it. The story of Marcus Wellington and Emily Patterson became a case study in business schools and social work programs, illustrating how personal transformation was possible, even for those who seemed most committed to callousness and self-interest. It demonstrated that everyone, even billionaire CEOs, deserved second chances to become better versions of themselves, and that sometimes the most powerful catalyst for change was the simple act of being forced to confront the human consequences of one's actions. Emily often reflected on how her father's tragic death had ultimately led to positive change for thousands of other families through Marcus's transformation and the programs they developed together. It was a bittersweet reminder that even the most painful experiences could become sources of healing and hope when channeled through compassion and determination to prevent others from suffering similar losses. The empty restaurant table where their confrontation had taken place became, in Emily's mind, a symbol of how quickly circumstances could change and how important it was to treat every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their current situation. After all, the powerful and the powerless were often separated by nothing more than chance, timing, and the kind of support systems that could either lift people up or let them fall through the cracks of an indifferent world.